Hello and welcome everyone to this latest edition of Special Meravisit Conversations. Today I have Professor Tony Magania for a guest. Professor Tony Magania is a neuroscientist and a Christian humanitarian who is also interested in researching languages. And he has, for the past 2 years and more than that, I would say, has been speaking and writing about Tigray. And today I invited him to give us his insights about what is happening in Tigray and in Ethiopia in general. And thank you for joining me today, Professor Tony Magania.
Well, thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you.
My pleasure. So I have been reading a lot of things that I have written about Tigray and about Ethiopia, and also some of the speeches that I have given. And I was wondering how I would introduce you, but I think I couldn't do better than letting you speak about how you became familiar with Tigray and with Ethiopia, and if you spoke a bit about yourself and how you connected, and then we'll go to the specific topics that we'll talk about today. So speak a bit about yourself.
Well, I first came to Ethiopia in 2012. I was invited to come visit by some diaspora. And initially, the first year and a half, I was in Addis and in Desse at Wolo University. And they had kind of a fiasco of building this tertiary hospital that never happened. And then I was recruited to go see Mekele in 2015 by leaders of the university, after I had a nice meeting with them in Addis, and found it had a lot of good things about it. It was a well-built hospital. The university was strong. They had MRI machines that were useful. I'm a neurosurgeon and neuroscientist by training. And I'm also, for the past 20 years, been I'm an active Episcopalian, which is the American form of the Anglican Church. And we're somewhere between Catholic and Protestant. We call ourselves in between. And it was an opportunity when I lived almost 10 years in Tigray, in Mekele, to learn about the people and the culture. And I'm also very active in studying religion. So we trained neurosurgeons. I was a part of the university. I was an advisor both to the national government and the Tigray regional government. We performed research on birth defects. Part of my research required me to travel to many areas in Tigray, which I got to know and work with the local people on reducing the number of neurotubular defects. So I think, and I lived in Tigray until I was evacuated in January of 2021. So I was there before the war, and I was there during the occupation of Mekele until January of 2021. And I'm still in contact with the university on a weekly basis and involved with organizations to help rebuild the university and tell the story.
Fascinating. We'll talk about the manner of your evacuation from in I think it must have been in sometime in November of 2020, if I'm right.
Well, it was late. It was late December. I can't give you the exact dates because
but thereabouts.
It's because I was actually evacuated through the intercession of a third country, which I don't want to talk about.
All right, but insofar as you want to tell us about the manner with which you were evacuated, we'll come to that later. But before we do that, I was wondering, could you have lived in Mekele now for about a decade, and
yes,
I think you would be more than well placed to tell us about what life was like in Mekele. How would you describe your time in Mekele?
Well, I mean, before the war, I mean, there like all of Ethiopia, there were kind of two sides to Tigray. Mekelle was a fairly modern city by African standards, very similar to Addis or Gondar or Awassa. We had a university of about 40,000 students. We had very strong graduate programs. Mekelle University was a federal university. It was mostly, but not totally, funded by the federal government. And that funding was based upon the population it served. Most 88% of Tigray lives in the rural area. So there's kind of a difference. The population of Mekelle had more educated people, more graduates. There was industry. There was a lot of development, and even extending out to cities like Wukro to the north, so the influence extended, and then the cities like Shiri and Axum were developing along that same line, not quite as developed. And then you had the countryside. And the sort of unique thing about, one of the unique things about Mekelle University was it was intimately involved with the regional state, probably more than what I saw in Desse or in other parts of Ethiopia, in that there was planning together. There wasn't competition between cities like you saw in the Amhara region. And there was a development plan that was somewhat central, but the goal was ultimately to improve the life of the people in the countryside. In fact, outside scholars have written about Mekelle University that as a research university, it was unique in Africa because it was devoted to improving local lifestyle by its research and technological interventions and sharing of knowledge.
Yeah, interesting. So in one of your blogs, you talk about how in the late night of November 4th of 2020, the war started, and the events that followed that, when the helicopters started to rain down bombs, and the sense of shock and desperation, and also the commotion that was created in Mekelle, and how people didn't know what was happening. Could you talk about the early days of the starting of the war and what the reaction in Mekelle around the places that you were?
I mean, we woke up. There was some television news that something had happened at Northern Command, but you have to remember that for months before that, we at the university were struggling with the fact that the federal government wanted to cut the funding and cut all the initiatives that the university was doing. There had been several episodes where federal police had tried to land into the airport and to arrest people that people knew about. Now, I'm not an expert on that, but I know that happened. I'm not an expert on the details. There was a growing sense that there was unease with the federal government, although nobody believed that a war would actually happen. But people were afraid that something was going to happen. Probably I'm one of those people that didn't. I was just busy at the hospital, so I didn't pay much attention. And then overnight, we're at war. In the first few days, we had electricity. We were seeing messages on TV. So there wasn't much effect. But then the jets started to fly over Mekelle, and there started to be air attacks. And then within 24 hours, we started to get casualties. And we got combatant casualties, fighters. We saw Eritreans right off the bat. It's easy for a Tigrayan to recognize an Eritrean. They were in Ethiopian uniforms, but they didn't speak Amharic. You can't be in the Ethiopian army and not speak Amharic. And they have a certain accent.
Sorry to cut you off. So you're talking about Eritrean personnel in Ethiopian uniforms?
Yes. Yeah, we saw them right away. And we started to see these women. Within the first 24 hours, we started to see women that were hurt, that suffered these mutilations and other things. And I'm a neurosurgeon, so I wasn't the one primarily treating those, but a lot of them had other injuries. They had head injuries and spine injuries. And what happened was, over the first few days, when there were a lot ambulances still working and there was still transportation, this massive amount of people started to come to Mekelle. Now, and there's also, what happened was the ambulances were gradually all taken by the occupying forces, by the invading forces, and transportation was stopped, so that the people coming from places like Shiri and Umera stopped after a few days. But then as the invading forces got closer, especially like from Wulkro is just immediately north. And we really started to see really terrible things: women shot in the back, vaginal mutilation, horrible things, children with their head partially cut off. And sometimes we would get 130 people an hour. And we were even beginning to see people that would walk. They were walking from Shiri and from and from Western Tigray. It takes 2 or 3 days walking to get to Mekelle. So, and by then, of course, the onslaught, there was the air bombardment, and then I think it was, if I recall, I think it was November 25th, 24th. I can't remember the days. So we had no electricity. We had no connection with the outside world, other than we heard that there was a threat that there was going to be a bombardment of the city unless the city surrendered. Then Tigray has these neighborhood kabeles. They're called kabeles. And there's very good networks coming from the old days of fighting the Derg, where there's communication. So we got word that all the fighters had left. There was not going to be a fight in Mekelle because they wanted to preserve the city. But even though there were no fighters left, then this 24-hour bombardment started. And these, I believe, were artillery rounds. And you could hear one. I live about 3 blocks from the hospital in southern Mekelle, northern Mekelle, and you heard an explosion about every 6 seconds, and this went on for 24 hours, and they landed all over the city. The morning after the bombardment, the bombardment started. It was the morning that the bombardment started. They hit the house right beside me. We had fragments coming through the windows of my house. One slightly hit my hand, and they killed most of the family members in the house right beside us, including children and grandmothers and an aunt. We found the mother of 2 children. She had her arms out like this, and there were 2 toddlers in her hands. They had shrapnel on their head, and where her chest was gone. It was just mush. She was obviously dead. Outside the house, there was her sister who suffered a near amputation of her leg. So the family took them together and went to Eider Hospital, and I went with them. The 2 children, we couldn't do an MRI or CT because there was no electricity. and we were just overwhelmed. But they did okay. They required some local treatment, and the woman, I don't know what happened to the woman. I think she had an amputation, but after that bombardment, things got worse because it was all over the city, and we don't know how many people died because by that point there were problems with, there were no ambulances, and there was limited private transportation. So obviously, the number of people that were killed at the site versus were able to come to the hospital, we don't know, but we saw hundreds in that 24-hour period, and that continued. The next day, it stopped for a while and then restarted for several hours, and then the occupying forces came in the city, and for days there would be some shooting and bombing around the city, and that was the situation. And of course, immediately occupation forces came and took over the area where we were, and they took over control of the hospital. Now, what happened was that the occupying forces kind of changed. There was a lot of regular Ethiopian defense forces initially, and then they changed to these red cap guys. And the problem is there's a lot of red caps in the military. So, but some of them were Amhara special forces, and then some were clearly Eritreans acting in groups of Eritreans, and that's when we started to see looting. So there would be these patrols that would go up and down the street, and they would stop at a grocery store and just go in and take what they wanted. They didn't pay anything to the merchants. They would break in and take televisions, and there's an area of Mekelle where there's a lot of stores in the downtown area where you could buy refrigerators and stoves and gas for cooking. All those things were looted. And they also would pick up girls walking on the street. And one of the things I just wrote about was the community did organize these youth groups where they would patrol, and they would patrol usually one guy because one guy wasn't a threat. They didn't have any arms. But like if a girl was walking down the street or a woman was walking down the street, they would alert them, hey, they're coming, so they'd hide them, and they'd even distract their attention. And at least 7 of those people were killed between November to when I left in January. And also, the thing I've also written about was what I call the defense of Eider Hospital. People knew that the telephone system and the main telephone headquarters with a lot of equipment was looted. They knew that the hospitals and clinics, even in Mekelle, were all looted. But what happened was there was a call, and I think it was about November 25th. The call started through the mosque. There's a mosque right close. I think it's called Adham Mosque. It's just a couple blocks from the hospital. They had generators and fuel so they could do the call to prayer. And which, by those who don't know, Bilal, the one who started that, was an Ethiopian slave that was freed by Muhammad's army. And so technically, so like that Ethiopian, they called out all Mekelle residents, save your hospital. So, and then other groups, like there was a motorcycle group that had some battery powered loudspeakers, and these youth groups. So thousands of people came out. They put tires and rocks and bottles trying to stop all traffic from going, because these Eritreans were coming with these big trucks, what we called looting trucks. And the population who was unarmed would not let them get near. And this went on for several days. And at night, people would burn tires. And I mean, there was like 3 or 4 people strong, at least a layer of, all the way around the hospital. Meckley, it's a huge campus. It's like 10 blocks. You know, it's a huge area, and it was totally surrounded by people. And at that time, there were these. There was about 10 soldiers in the front of the hospital and at the gates. They did shoot some young men of these youth groups who were yelling at them, but that's all they were doing. We took them into the hospital, but the next day the soldiers came into the hospital and took them away, at least 2 of them. And that wasn't unusual, what would happen to these youth patrols. But eventually, I think the decision was made by the Eritreans not to loot Meckley Hospital because it would have created such a scene. There was at that time a lot of diaspora in Meckley, and there were probably 200, 300 foreigners who were all witnesses to this. And I guess that they didn't want to have witnesses if they created a mass shooting of people. So that's how Meckley Hospital was saved. But then what happened was, so we saw a lot of these women victims, and we had some terrible things like the soldiers would bring the women and tell the nurses to clean them up, and then they would take the women out again, which Dr. Hayelem, who was the research head at the medical college and temporary head of the hospital, has talked about. And I saw some of that. We tried to talk to.
So why were they doing that? Why were they telling the nurses to clean up the women and take
because
them?
they were going to abuse them again, and the women were terrified, but there was nothing we could do. You know, I think some of them they were able to hide, but within the first few days, there was a soldier in almost every room of the hospital. Like, for example, the emergency room nurse head, she always kept the doors locked, and she always kind of pushed them. She is a very brave woman. I don't know what happened to her. She always kept them out of getting into medical stocks and things like that. They were a little bit intimidated in the hospital, except about sort of like trafficking the women for themselves. But we started to run out of supplies, and Dr. Fetian, who was the acting head of the university, and Hayelem went to meet with the commander of the military commander of the hospital, and also Mulunega when he was appointed the mayor, the interim mayor. And they refused to do anything. They called Leah Tadasi, who actually trained in Meckley University. You know, she knows what she knows about medicine, and she just refused to do anything. She said, I can't do anything. And then she promised that something would be done. But basically, from that point on, the hospital never got any supplies. The hospital was removed from the budgets. It was removed from existence. Okay, we had students from other countries, and we had students from many other regions. They weren't all Tigrayan. And the university kept putting out these bizarre messages like, just take care of them and we'll come get them. But fortunately, the people of Meckley were very nice to them, even the Amhara students. They fed them, they clothed them, they invited them to the house, they brought food to the dorms. You know, even the Tigray mothers, when it's kind of a cold season when the war started. It gets cold at night. It rains a little bit. And we had a shortage of blankets, and we had a shortage of food. So Tigray mothers came to the hospital, and they gave food and blankets to many of the patients, including the combatant prisoners, including the Eritreans and the Amhara that were injured and brought to the hospital. They said, you know, I don't know what happened to my children, but I hope your mother sees you again. I pray for her. You know, that was a very common thing. You know, I saw it many times. Um, but the situation, you know, just was getting worse and worse. I mean, the sort of flagrant, these patrols would just break into stores, they'd hassle people. People became afraid to travel in the streets. There were curfews, and the curfew first was like 8 o'clock, then it was 6 o'clock. And they got to where they would just shoot people on sight. And one of the things they would do, which came out of the old Derg regime would do, and I first heard about this from Reverend Douglas, who was a Feringe Protestant missionary who married a Tigranian woman 14 years before and lived there. Was near the Desta Hotel, which is close to the business campus. The Eritreans had shot a young boy about 14 years old who was one of these youth patrols. They're unarmed, but they wouldn't let anybody recover his body. And there were these birds of these vultures circling, which they will tend to do. You know, there's a lot of birds in Mekelle. And this is what the Derg used to do as a warning to the city that this is what happens. And we saw that throughout the city. You know, in fact, another thing that happened, for example, is we used to get, we had a problem with bodies, because you can imagine you're getting 130 bodies an hour. There's no place to put the bodies. And people wanted to take the bodies home and bury them. But what happened was these soldiers were in the hospital, and a lot of them couldn't read or write anyway, but they were telling us, don't write that the TPLF did this. You know, it's like what these no more people do now. They deny that they did anything. Why would the Tigray forces hurt their own people? And they wanted us to write like that. They wanted us to write things which usually we refused to do. If it was an Eritrean soldier, he couldn't read the Amhara. If it's an Amhara soldier, he couldn't read the way that we wrote in Tigray, or we wrote it in English. But they would take the bodies and we don't know what they did with them. They would come with trucks and families were quite upset because they couldn't bury their relatives. Their bodies would disappear. At the same time, initially, the combatants of all sides were taken care of by us. Eventually, they created a sort of infirmary, not a real hospital, at the stadium, which is near the Planet Hotel, which they didn't have any doctors. I mean, there is an interesting thing. One of the things we knew, which shows to the pre-planning of the Ethiopian government towards this, we learned later that the Ethiopian government had recruited physicians to be involved in the medical care of their military injuries. And they had stationed doctors in Waldea. And we learned this later. They had a whole plan well before this November 4th incident. There was a federal military hospital that kind of functioned, and we sent some IDER doctors there. They just took care of Ethiopian Defense Force casualties. But then that kind of died out. I don't think it was that well supplied. And so that kind of was my experience. There was, when I was there was pretty good community organization. Give me 1 second. I apologize. Give me one.
No problem. Take your time. Apologies to our listeners. We'll be back in a sec. But until he comes back, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share the YouTube channel to reach to as many people as possible. we're trying to get as many people who were in Tigray when the war started. That's our focus for now. We want to get as much detail as possible about what transpired, because a lot has been hidden from us. So we need people like Professor Tony. Well, welcome back. So that was an incredible elucidation of what happened from November 4 until the day you left. And I'm impressed by your photographic memory, your ability to recall events as they happened in the same order as they happened. It's just incredible. But I would pick up some of the very important points you raised. The first one, I was really surprised to hear from you now that Eritrean personnel in Ethiopian uniform were involved as early as that, because the common wisdom, the understanding is that Eritreans joined only later, and even when they did join, they weren't really in Ethiopian uniform, but they were fighting in their own uniform. But now, listening to you, it looks like that they were immersed in the Ethiopian army in Ethiopian uniforms, and I think that's new information to me, at least. But the other point that I found interesting was when he said Leah Tadesse came and said that although she acknowledged the destruction and looting of the hospital, she said that there was nothing that she could do. And I'm just wondering, did she give a reason as to why she wasn't in a position to do anything, or she said that because the government wasn't going to help her anyway? Which was that?
Well, I didn't listen into the conversation, but the conversation was told to me by Dr. Fettin and Dr. Hayelum, and they also met with Mulu Nega. You know, what happened was all the Ethiopian and Eritrean bigwigs, they all collected at the Planet Hotel, and so they went over there to talk to them, and their attitude was sarcastic, and it's not, you know, the comments were made, it's not our job to worry about your weeds, your cancer, or something like that. And the attitude I heard from Tadesse was, it's not her problem, you know. And it's just it was total denial that she had any ability to do anything or had any responsibility. She didn't even reflect even a care about a place where she lived and worked and learned.
You know? So it wasn't just that she felt helpless, it was also that she couldn't acknowledge the destruction.
She didn't care. I mean, you know, she just didn't care. You know, which I think is subsequently, I mean, the problem didn't exist.
Yeah. Well, one of the difficult things to fathom for us has been the fact that the health ministry that she heads has been standing on the way of medical supplies getting into Tigray.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, for example, Fano, which is very close to the Ethiopian government, regardless of which we all know, they've been putting pictures out on Twitter showing the WHO giving some supplies that are supposed to go to Tigray. And they show some trucks. There's no fuel for trucks in Mekelle. And there's no fuel at all outside of Mekelle. So the only place to get supplies is Mekelle, because there's no fuel to take it outside. And the only people giving medical supplies is the WHO. But the Ethiopian government is not contributing to that, you know, and they're misleading, because now, like I said, they're putting these pictures of the WHO like Ethiopia's doing that. They're doing nothing. And they're avoiding responsibility by saying, oh, it's the Afar people and they're the ones blocking it. There's nothing we can do. It's the Amhara people. There's the ones blocking it. There's nothing we can do.
All right. Yeah, I mentioned the case of the health minister because some people who want to give her the benefit of the doubt say that she really wants us to help. It's just that the system and the regime isn't allowing her to do that. But from your description and explanation, it doesn't look like that she has had any interest in
if
helping.
you claim to be a Christian or a believer, you have to take a stand. I don't think anybody would shoot her if she said we need to help Tigray.
That's a fair point. Am I right in concluding that the Ethiopian forces, the defense forces, continue to shell and bomb Mekelle even after the Tigray defense forces had already left and they knew that they had left?
Yes.
Why?
Well, I mean, I think it goes to that they wanted to be punitive, and I mean that's the whole thing about calling this a law enforcement operation. If it was a law enforcement operation, you would have been friendly to the population. You would have said, if it's true that these people are bad for you, we'll show you good. But from the very beginning, they inflamed it. We now know, by the way, that by satellite, you can see there was military buildup around Gondar. There was military buildup on the Eritrean Tigray border. All these things were done before November 4th. And there was clearly, the soldiers have told us, the Eritrean soldiers and ENDF soldiers have told us that they were supposed to kill children. Some have said male children under age 7. Others have said age 4. They even told, I was there in the hospital hearing this, that was their job. This job that they were supposed to wipe out the seed of the Tigray, because you had these religious leaders saying that they're a weed, that they're the devil, they're satanic, all these things. And so we're mostly dealing with uneducated soldiers, mostly come from the countryside, or they're poor workers in the city, and they're looking up to people of a different social class that are supposedly educated. So they're relying upon them to give them good information, and this is what they were told.
Yeah, well, I think we're going to kind of park this train here, the train of what happened in Mekelle, what you witnessed and all that. And thank you for describing all the horrific atrocities, the murder, the plunder, and the sexual violence against women as well. And we can only imagine things that happened off camera by far worse. And also, if you remember, Ethiopian forces and the Eritrean forces became even more vengeful after they started losing in the battlefronts in Tembien. So I think the horrific events that you described would pale in comparison to the things that they would have gone on to do in other areas of Tigray, outside any observation or out of and all that. But I think we will leave that at that, because we have a lot of ground to cover that I want you to talk about, because you have written a lot. And also because you don't want to talk about how you were evacuated and what happened, we will just fast forward to now, and we'll talk about some of the things that you have written about lately. One of the issues that you have written about is your reflection following the barbaric footage that emerged last week about a man being burnt alive, a Tigrayan man. Also, it later transpired that there were other people who had been burnt as well. And you say that, don't say burning, but cannibalism in general is not something new. There have been practices of cannibalism in Ethiopia in history, and you try to kind of explore, and you talk about 3 issues that I found interesting. The first one you talked about was famine cannibalism that was practiced in the 17th century in the south part of Ethiopia. You also talk about mortuary cannibalism, which I found very interesting in a negative sense, not in its positive sense. But also, we say that some armies use cannibalism as a psychological warfare tactic. And could you kind of explore and expand
Well,
a bit?
well, like many countries in Africa, the philosophical view about afterlife and religion is a mix of early tribal ideas and more modern religious ideas. And it's well in southern Ethiopia, in the SNNP regions, there were groups of tribes that believed that cannibalism was reasonable, and what they practiced it in two ways. One was called. Let me just find the name here. One was called Kwamtut, and Kwamtut is a practice where after people are buried within a few days, grave hunters will come and take the bodies. And normally, I mean, they even a week or two later. So it became very common in southern Ethiopia for graves to be guarded. After a month or so, the bodies deteriorate so much that there's no value to it. And then there's another thing called Goro Goro, which is where you intimidate your enemies, and you torture them, and you kill them and eat their bodies. And in tribal history, that supposedly weakens the tribe and gives you power over them. And it's a form of a psychological weapon. Kind of similar to the way the Aztecs did against the Spaniards when the Spanish conquest of Mexico was happening. That they would attack the Spanish soldiers and cut them apart and eat them and eat their parts. And in Ethiopia, so these things have gone on for centuries. There were wars between Christians and Muslims centuries ago where famine started around Harar, and weak individuals were killed and eaten. And during the Amharic conquest of the Oromo region, the Amharas did it to the Oromos. And there's documented incidents of that in Amharic in historical text. And these are existing fears that people have. So, and it also points to the fact that these are very sophisticated psychological warfare things. This same and the other thing that relates to the bodies is both the tribal beliefs and the Christian beliefs, and even the Muslim beliefs in Ethiopia, are that we go from dust to dust, and that our body should be returned to the earth for natural corruption. And that if you're not buried and hyenas eat you, it affects your chance for an afterlife. In fact, I know from being a practicing physician in Ethiopia that, for example, if someone had diabetes and had a bad leg that had to be amputated to save their life, many people would not allow that because they were fearful that it was against God, because we're created in God's image, and that if you alter the body, you won't come back. So if your body's fed to hyenas, there's a very well documented incident in trying to remember the name, the city that was bombed by the Derg, starts with an H. But there's an incident where
Hausen? Is that Hausen?
Yeah, Hausen. There's an incident where the farmers captured an Eritrean soldier during the invasion of Hausen. And he's telling them, please take me to the church because and don't feed me to the hyenas. So somebody's already talked to him. So he's afraid that that the Ethiopians that the Tigray are going to do that to him, what he's been told to do to them. And they don't. They take him to the hospital, and they actually took him to a church, you know. Although a lot of Eritreans are not in the army are not Christians. They're Ben Amin kind of gangster types that don't have a religion. But so these things exist in the culture of the area. And it's a well-established form of, and it's been done also in the wars in South Sudan. They did the same thing. They fed people to hyenas. They didn't bury the bodies. So this phenomenon is well known.
Yeah. So as you will have observed on social media, the vast majority of people couldn't explain why in this day and age a person would be inspired to set another person ablaze. And we are at a loss as to why. But you seem to be implying that when they were setting the person ablaze on fire, they weren't really acting in vengeance, but they were tapping into something that they have been educated, or something that exists underneath, philosophically. Is that the point you're trying to?
Yeah, and there's another thing too. I mean, a part of what Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki have done is to convince their soldiers that the Tigray are not human. They've done the classic we versus they. They're not creations of God. What Daniel Cabret is saying, these are not human beings. And therefore you're allowed to rape the women, you're allowed to kill the children, you're allowed to burn people alive. They're not human, so they can't suffer.
Yeah.
So the government encourages their behaviors to get the soldiers to be even more evil. And so this under religion is blasphemy. I mean, they as leaders are encouraging people to do evil.
Yes, but actually, to your point, I will add two things that happened. I think about, say, 4 months ago, when there was hysteria in Addis Ababa regarding the state of emergency, and when every Tigrayan on the street was being rounded up. Abiy enjoined the entire nation that it was the responsibility of every citizen to protect themselves from them. So he implied Tigrayans. And then a couple of days later, the mayor of Addis Ababa said that she was trying to explain why the state of emergency was appropriate and why thousands of Tigrayans were being rounded up. She said that it was up to every Tigrayan to demonstrate, to prove that they are innocent.
Yeah.
It was implying that every Tigrayan should be considered as guilty until proven innocent. Now, when you combine these two very dangerous statements from people at the very top, what you get is an environment where anything goes. So that if you ban a person, you could explain, you could say that, well, I was endangered by that person. I had to protect myself, so I had to burn him, or I had to behead him, or you could say anything really, as long as you have created a culture of anything goes, or a culture where people could get away with burning in this specific case. So you're right.
Once they're no longer human, anything goes.
Absolutely. So I think that's well covered now. And the other point that you have written about is the glaring, blatant double standard of international bodies when it comes to their coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Ethiopian and Eritrean invasion of Tigray. And you say that although by every measure, the crisis in Tigray is much, much worse than the one in Ukraine, although you express your sympathy to the Ukrainians and say that the Ukrainians deserve every bit of support that they have managed to get.
Yeah.
You say that the international community hasn't been as sympathetic to the Tigrayans. And you mention the issue of the medical journal Lancet, where they received a manuscript from Tigrayans about the disruption to the health system in Tigray, and they declined to publish it. Why they were?
Well, they did accept under Dr. Mulugeta, who's a great academician at the University of South Carolina, this joint paper from Mecca University and outside collaborators, where they analyzed what the damage was to the healthcare system. But they refused to publish a commentary on the immorality of this and what the damage that it's going to do to the public, saying it was out of the scope of Lancet. But at the same time, just a few days ago, they published a big editorial about how bad it was that the Russians were destroying. So yeah, that's, and this is, this is the problem. You sort of have a two-edged sword here, in that you have the African Union and these so-called Pan-Africans saying, we don't want the West to interfere with us, but we want to have a voice in the United Nations, but we don't want them to have any influence over us. And then at the same time, you have the Western world is, like everybody else, is concerned mostly about their own security. And the concern about Ukraine is this is a showdown between NATO and Russia. So it has implications of a third world war. But I will tell you that one of the problems, what people don't see, even Ethiopia is of national concern. Why? Because it's close to the Red Sea. Russia wants to put a base in Sudan. The Chinese are in Djibouti. Now, the U.S. is in Djibouti. But now Abiy Ahmed is talking with the Russians about putting Russian Air Force, and Eritrea is talking about putting Russian military. This will affect the safety of the Red Sea. So it is of international concern. Of course, even more importantly, it's humanitarian concern, because the Bible tells us that we're all equal. We're all created in God's image. Every person on this earth is equal to every other person. And as Dr. Tedros wrote, the greatest threat to humanity, as bad as, and they're helping Ukraine, is Ethiopia. 500,000 people. They part of that, if you look at that thing that was published by Martin Platt and Ghent University, who we do some work with, they used my estimation of death based upon what's called the crude death rate. The crude death rate is a measure of how many people per 1,000 population die per year. And it was measured in Ethiopia in the 50s, and it was like 32 per 1,000. And that was when there was no health care at all in Ethiopia. And it was measured recently in Ethiopia to be 6. So it had gone from 32 to 6. So we were able to calculate that 32 per 1,000 people would die in Tigray if there was no health care, which was over 200,000. Women would die in childbirth, treatable illnesses like diabetes and pneumonia, people would die. A simple appendectomy, simple accidents. You've got no treatment. You're like in the 15th century. You're back in Ethiopia pre-World War II.
What's your message to the people who claim to be deeply religious in Ethiopia, starting from the upper echelons of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church? I think excluding the patriarch, because he has spoken against the war, but he has since been muzzled. But other than him, I think there has been absolute either silent or open support for the government to go ahead with the war and devastate Tigray. And the same applies to all.
Well, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is complicated because it really started in Axum. And then you have the very strong Syriac Christian influence that sent the missionaries into Ethiopia. And after the death of Johannes, when he wasn't helped by the Amhara. You have about a century and a half ago the rise of the Amhara kingdom versus the Tigray kingdom. But the Tigray kingdom was never expansionist, whereas when the Amhara took over, they went to conquer Oromia. They made friends with the European powers to get the Muslim countries and the southern regions. So they always had two different philosophies. And also the church changed. There began to be this competition in ideas. And the imperialist idea of the church really grew under the Amhara. And this has been a problem. Donatism, which is this idea that the priests are perfect and what they say is superior to civil leaders, grew stronger. So it's a complicated issue to discuss, but it's a philosophy issue in the difference of the church. And the synods, the synods that formed, especially in the United States and in the Caribbean, played a role in this development of Amharic expansionism. And along with that, there's another factor, which is most of the immigrants to the United States and to a lesser extent to Europe happened in the 1990s. They were pro-monarchists that were leaving during the Derg, and they were people that were supporting the Derg that were defeated by the Tigray and United Forces. Whereas that the immigration to the United States dropped by the year 2000. Most of the immigration that happened afterwards were for educational opportunities. So this group of people, that most Ethiopian Americans were supporters of the monarchy or the Derg, and they dreamed of this Amhara re-expansion, which when Abiy came to the U.S. in 2018, he connected with these people and saw a potential power base. And that's in a nutshell what happened.
Yeah, he has been exploiting the church. You're right. I think we're about to hit the 1 hour mark, which is the amount of time that we have got. But before we wrap up, I will ask you one more kind of final question, and that is, I think our listeners would want to hear from you. Do you plan and hope to go back to Matala and continue your work there?
Yeah. I mean, I actually tried to return just before the it was in I can't remember the exact day, but I had a flight to return, but the Ethiopian government wouldn't let me back in. This was during the occupation, and I had said nothing. And actually, I avoided talking about the situation because the city was under, and many people I knew, and I only started to talk about these things after Tigray, at least Eastern Tigray, was reclaimed. And it's, I love the Tigray people. I relate to them a lot. It's a ministry. It's that I started 10 years ago, and it needs to continue. And actually, I had some offers to do some things in other places, but I feel like it's a betrayal if I'm not supporting them, because I've invested so much and I feel close to them. But yeah. I feel sorry for all of Ethiopia and what's happened. I feel sorry for the Eritreans and what's happened to them. No, they have gained nothing through all of this.
Well, thank you, Professor Tony Magania. It was a fascinating conversation. I'm sure I will have you on another time. But thanks for taking the time today to tell me about your experience in Tigray, and also the work that you continue to do. And thank you for continuing to speak up and to write about the truth. And I think you said that you love the people of Tigray, and I'm sure that the people of Tigray also love you. And when the right moment comes, I think we will take the time to appreciate and admire all the work that you continue to do. Although you do it because it gives you purpose, it gives you essence. But we appreciate that you continue to support the Tigray cause. And we are immensely grateful for that, and continue doing that, and long health and life to you. Thank you very much for joining me today.
All right. Well, thank you. It was a great honor, and I'm always available. And let's just pray that peace comes.
Yep.
Amen.
Let peace come. Thank you. Amen. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.